The vial was cold against her palm, a tiny glass prison of evidence. Elara stood in the center of the king's sprawling bedchamber, a room she'd never been invited to enter in 15 years of marriage, and stared at the small empty vessel she'd plucked from the silver tray beside his massive bed. Moonlight, sharp and unforgiving, cut through the tall windows, glinting off the crystal stopper she'd found lying beside it. The scent of it, bitterroot and poppy dust, still clung to the air, a ghost of the potion that had ensured her husband's dreamless, untouchable sleep every single night of their union. Her heart was a dead, cold weight in her chest. She didn't breathe. She didn't think. She just saw. The confirmation of a suspicion she'd carried for a decade and a half, made physical. He hadn't rejected her touch. He had chemically obliterated the very possibility of it. A floorboard creaked in the antechamber. Elara's head snapped up, her long silver-threaded braid slipping over her shoulder. The quiet dignity she wore like a second skin tightened around her. A reflexive armor. She closed her fingers over the vial, its edges biting into her flesh. She was the moon-crowned queen of the Silver Veil, mate bonded by treaty to the Alpha King Kaelen, and she was an intruder in his private space. The shame of it was a hot flush beneath her ice, but it was drowned by a sharper, older ache, the profound, echoing loneliness of the untouched. The door to the bedchamber swung open. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. He filled the doorway, a silhouette of power and shadow. King Kaelen. Even without the shimmer of his wolf just beneath the surface, his presence was a physical pressure in the room, a deep thrum of dominance that made the air taste of pine and cold stone. He was barefoot, dressed only in dark linen trousers, his chest a landscape of scarred muscle and old wars. His silver eyes, the mark of the Alpha line, went directly to her closed fist. Elara did not drop her gaze. She lifted her chin, the delicate points of her ears, the only visible heritage of her own, fire-touched bloodline peeking through the fall of her ash-brown hair. She let the silence stretch, let him see her standing there in the heart of his sanctuary, a ghost in her own palace. Elara. His voice was a low rumble, sleep-roughened, but edged with a warning. This is not your place. And what is my place, my king? She asked, her own voice deceptively calm, a still pond over unfathomable depths. She opened her hand, revealing the vial on her pale palm. The moonlight caught it, making it gleam like an accusation. Is it in my own chambers, alone, while you drink yourself into a stupor to avoid sharing a bed with your queen? A muscle ticked in his jaw. He stepped fully into the room, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft, definitive click. The sound felt like the ceiling of a tomb. You do not understand what you hold. I understand perfectly. The words were knives, sharpened by 15 years of silent meals, of formal touches at court functions, of watching him turn away every time she drew near. I understand that for 15 years I believed I was lacking, that the mate bond the seers swore was unbreakable was simply dormant in me, that the fault was mine. She took a step forward, the silk of her nightgown whispering against the stone floor. But it wasn't me, was it? It was this, every night. A deliberate choice. Kaelen's eyes glowed faintly, a sign of his wolf's agitation. He didn't deny it. His silence was a confession more damning than any words. The bond is a political tool, Elara. A necessity to unite the Veil and the Wolfkin after the war. It was never meant to be more. The draft ensures peace. It ensures I do not. He stopped himself, but the unsaid words hung in the air between them, charged and dangerous. It ensures I do not claim you. The ache in her chest splintered, giving way to a spark of something hotter, something that had been buried under layers of resignation. It ensures you do not feel, she corrected, her composure cracking. It ensures you do not have to face the woman you were tied to. Tell me, do you hate the treaty so much? Or is it just me? It is not hatred. He said it too quickly, his gaze dropping from hers to the vial, then back to her face. There was a war in his eyes, one she had never been close enough to see before. It is control. The bond, if left unchecked, it is a madness. A distraction. I have a kingdom to rule, enemies on every border. I cannot afford a weakness. I am your weakness. She stated it flatly. The final, brutal truth. Yes, the single word was a blow. It stole the air from her lungs. For years, she had sculpted herself into the image of a perfect queen, dignified, graceful, unshackable. She had borne the court's whispers, the pitying looks, the speculation over her barrenness, all while believing the distance was a mutual, unspoken agreement, a tragedy of fate. To have it reduced to a calculated strategy, to be categorized as a liability he had to drug himself to neutralize. It shattered the last of her quiet illusions. Her hand trembled. The vial shook, a tiny, mocking chime. Kaelen saw it. He took another step forward, and now she could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the lingering scent of the draft on his skin, soured by sleep. It was the closest they had been in years. Her senses, heightened by her own latent magic, reeled. Beneath the bitterroot, he smelled of winter forests and wild, untamed power. It called to something in her blood, something that had lain dormant and starving for so long. It was now just a dull throb of wrongness. Give it to me, Elara. His voice was softer now, but no less commanding. Why? She whispered, her eyes searching his face. This familiar stranger who was her husband. She saw the lines of tension, the weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. So you can forget me again tonight, and every night after. It is not about forgetting. His hand came up, not to take the vial, but hovering near her wrist. He did not touch her. He never touched her. It is about surviving this. This? A bitter, broken laugh escaped her. Our marriage? Our bond? What is so terrible that you must sleep through it? His wolf-bright eyes held hers, and for a fleeting second, the rigid control he wore like crown iron slipped. She saw not the implacable king, but a man staring into an abyss. The wanting. The air left the room. Elara went utterly still. The two words echoed in the vast, silent space, reshaping everything. They weren't a rejection. They were a confession of a different kind, more terrifying than any indifference. Before she could process it, before she could dare to breathe meaning into them, a frantic knocking shattered the moment. My king, your majesty. It was Torin, the captain of the guard, his voice strained through the thick wood. A contingent from the Ironwood pack has arrived at the gates unannounced. Their Alpha is with them. He demands an immediate audience. He says he's come to challenge for the queen. Kaelen's head whipped toward the door, every trace of the conflicted man vanishing, replaced by the terrifying visage of the Alpha King. The glow in his eyes flared, a silver fire. What? Elara's blood ran cold. The Ironwood pack was from the northern wastes, brutal and expansionist. They had never accepted the treaty that had ended the war and bound her to Kaelen. A challenge for a queen was a challenge for the throne itself, a throwback to the oldest, most savage of their laws. Torin's voice came again, grim. He claims the mate bond between you and the queen is invalid, unconsummated. He says the moon crown is therefore forfeit, and the queen is open to claim by any alpha strong enough to take her. The vial finally slipped from Elara's numb fingers. It struck the rug with a soft, dull thud, rolling towards Kaelen's feet. He looked from the vial to her, his expression a storm. The political stakes she had lived with for years suddenly sharpened into a single, razor point aimed directly at her heart. Her value, her safety, the fragile peace of the entire realm, had just been tied to the one thing she and her king had never done. Touch. The quiet, endless ache of 15 years was over. It was now a screaming, immediate danger. Kaelen's gaze locked with hers. In it she saw the calculations of a king, the fury of an alpha, and beneath it all, a flicker of something primal and possessive that the sleeping draft had kept buried for a decade and a half. The world outside the door was about to crash in, demanding a performance they had never given. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice guttural. He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. The command in his eyes was absolute. "Do not leave this room." But as he threw open the door to face the challenge, his final words were not those of a king to a political pawn. They were low, raw, and meant only for her ears. A vow that vibrated in the marrow of her bones. "Mine. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story." The door slammed shut behind Kaelen, with a finality that shuddered through the stone. Elara stood alone in the center of his chamber, the echo of his guttural "mine," a brand against her soul. It wasn't a promise. It was a primal declaration, a seismic shift in the ground beneath her feet. For 15 years, she had been a possession in name only, a portrait on a coin, a signature on a treaty. Now, in the face of a rival's claim, the word had teeth. Her gaze fell to the empty vial at her feet. The physical proof of his rejection now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. The wanting. He had wanted her. All this time. The knowledge was not a balm. It was a new kind of torment. He had wanted her, and he had chosen, night after night, to drink himself into oblivion rather than act on it. Was that control? Or was it a fear so profound it eclipsed even the infamous Alpha will? The shouting from the courtyard below began to filter through the leaded glass-deep challenging bellows. The snarls of wolves not yet shifted. The sharp commands of Kaelen's guards. Chaos was knocking at the gates, and its key was the open secret of her untouched bed. Her place was at his side. Queen. Mate. Yet his last command had been to stay. To hide. A caged asset. The spark of heat his confession had ignited curdled into a cold, sharp clarity. She was tired of being a symbol. A weakness to be managed. A prize to be challenged for. She would not hide in his den. Moving with a grace that belied the tremor in her limbs, Elara crossed the room. She ignored the vast bed, the tangible center of all her silent yearning, and went to a carved armoire. Inside, beside Kaelen's cloaks and formal wear, hung a garment of midnight blue velvet, embroidered with tiny silver phases of the moon, her ceremonial robe for the blood moon hearings. It was armor of a different sort. She shed her simple nightgown, letting the silk pool on the rug beside the vial. The cool air raised goosebumps on her skin no lover had ever learned. She drew the heavy velvet over her shoulders, the weight of it settling like a resolve. She pinned her braid into a severe coronet at the back of her head, and secured the slender moon crown, a delicate star-pierced circlet of mithril onto her brow. In the reflection of Kaelen's darkened window, she saw not the wounded wife, but the queen of the silver veil. Her eyes, a storm grey inherited from her mother, held a glint she hadn't seen in years. She left the chamber, not through the antechamber door where Torin lightly stood guard, but through a small, hidden passage known only to the monarchs, a relic of a more paranoid age. The stone passage was narrow and cold, smelling of dust and damp. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound as she descended a spiral staircase that opened into a shadowed gallery overlooking the great hall's rear entrance. The noise was overwhelming here. The hall was not yet full, but the tension was a live wire in the air. She could see Kaelen's broad back at the far end, standing before the sunstone throne. He was now clad in his own ceremonial leathers, the obsidian pauldrons carved like snarling wolf heads. He radiated a contained violence that stilled the air around him. And facing him, flanked by 4 hulking, bare-chested warriors smelling of iron and blood moss, was Alpha Rykard of the Ironwood. Rykard was all brutal angles and scarred flesh, his head shaved, his beard braided with bone. His eyes, a flat, hungry yellow, scanned the hall with open contempt before landing back on Kaelen. "No court formalities, Kaelen," Rykard's voice boomed, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "We both know why I'm here. The border skirmishes are just the whelp's play. The real sickness is here at the heart. A king who cannot keep his own mate. A bond that rings hollow. The land feels it. The packs smell the weakness." Kaelen didn't move, but the temperature in the hall seemed to drop. "You tread on ground that will swallow you, Rykard. My mate bond is not your concern. It is every alpha's concern when it undermines the natural order." Rykard spat on the polished floor. 15 years and no heir? No scent mark on your queen? No spark of the bond's power in the air when you stand together? You tied yourself to a fire-touched wraith for peace, but you forgot the first law. What is claimed must be held, by tooth and claw. You have not held her, therefore she is unheld. Elara's fingers tightened on the cold stone balustrade of the gallery. The vulgarity of it, the reduction of her life, her loyalty, to a scent mark made her stomach churn. Yet, in the brutal logic of Wolfkind, he was not entirely wrong. Their bond was perfunctory. It had no texture, no presence. It was a signature on parchment, not a living thing. The laws of challenge are for contested thrones or unmated females. Kaelen's voice was deathly quiet, the calm before the evisceration. "Elara is neither. She is my queen. Your grievance is with me, not her. Take it to the battlefield, if you dare." "My grievance is with the farce." Rykard took a step forward, his warriors mirroring him. The guards along the walls gripped their spears tighter. "I challenge the validity of the bond itself. I invoke the right of scent. Bring her out. Let her stand between us. Let the truth in the air decide." A ripple of shock went through the assembled courtiers and guards who had begun to filter in. The rite of scent was an ancient, seldom used ritual. The female in question would be presented between 2 rival males. According to law, the bond, true, deep, and consummated, would create an invisible pull, a recognizable signature that would declare its allegiance. It was a test of primal magic, not politics. For a bond like hers and Kaelen's, it would be a death sentence. Kaelen's fists clenched at his sides. "You overreach. I will not subject my queen to your barbaric pantomime. Then you admit the truth." Rykard crowed, spreading his arms wide to address the now muttering crowd. "He fears the test because he knows what all of you have suspected. The moon-crowned queen is a ghost in this palace, a political ornament. The bond is a lie, and the silver veil is ruled by a lie." The accusation hung, poisonously effective. Elara saw the doubt on the faces of some in the crowd, lesser nobles, warriors from packs whose allegiance was newer. Kaelen's rule was absolute, but it was built on strength and the fragile peace the marriage treaty had brought. This struck at the foundation. She could see the tension coiling in Kaelen's shoulders, the promise of slaughter in the set of his jaw. He would fight. He would kill Rykard here in the hall and plunge the northern border into immediate all-out war. Thousands would die. Her veil would burn. All because of the secret they had kept. The weight of 15 years of lonely dignity, of quiet endurance, culminated in this moment. She had hidden behind her title, behind his coldness. She would not hide behind a war. Before Kaelen could erupt, before blades could be drawn, Elara moved. She walked from the shadowed gallery, down the few steps into the main hall. The tap of her shoes on the stone was like a drumbeat in the sudden, gasping silence. Every head turned. The crowd parted before her as if by an unseen force. Kaelen's head snapped toward her. His silver eyes flared with a shock that immediately morphed into raw, blistering fury. "I told you to stay." The unspoken command screamed across the space between them. She met his gaze, her own steady, and gave him the faintest, almost imperceptible shake of her head. No. She walked until she stood exactly midway between the two alphas, the heavy velvet of her robe brushing the floor. The air crackled. Rykard's hungry yellow eyes raked over her with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. Kaelen's gaze was a brand, willing her back, screaming with a protectiveness she had never seen directed at her before. "You called for the right of scent, Alpha Rykard," Elara said, her voice clear and cool, carrying to the farthest corner of the hall. The voice of a queen holding court. "Here I am." The silence was absolute. Rykard's grin was a slash of triumph. He inhaled deeply, theatrically. Kaelen stood frozen, a statue of rage and dread. Elara closed her eyes for a brief second, centering herself. This was madness. She was walking into a trap of her own making. The bond was a dormant seed, untended, unwatered. There would be no magical pull toward Kaelen. There would be nothing but the hollow echo of their shared failure. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Kaelen. "I'm sorry," she thought. "For everything." Then she opened herself. Not just her physical presence, but the inner walls she'd built to survive the loneliness. She let the quiet ache of wanting him surface. The memory of his heat in the bedchamber. The devastating confession in his voice. The wanting. She let it all pool in her chest. A silent, desperate offering to a bond that had never been given a chance to breathe. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. Only the cold emptiness of the great hall, the scent of fear and anticipation from the crowd. Rykard's metallic stench, Kaelen's pine and stone. Then a spark. It began as a warmth in the center of her palm, the one that had held the vial. It spiraled up her arm, a thread of golden heat. A low, resonant hum filled her ears, a frequency felt more than heard, and his scent deepened, intensified, wrapping around her not from the air, but from within her own blood. Pine, cold stone, and now, underneath, wild amber and something uniquely, fundamentally Kaelen. Across from her, Kaelen shuddered, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. His glowing eyes widened, fixed on her with a shock that mirrored her own. She saw his chest heave, saw his nostrils flare as if scenting the air for the first time. But the thread of warmth didn't just connect her to him. It pulsed outward, a visible, shimmering ripple in the air between them. A faint, luminescent cord of silver and gold, flickering like captured moonlight. It was thin, delicate as a spider's silk, but it was there. It stretched from her heart to his, humming with a latent, sleeping power. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Rykard's triumphant grin vanished, replaced by stunned disbelief. Impossible. A trick. That is not the mark of a true bond. It's weak. Pathetic. He was right. It was not the thick, vibrant tether of stories. It was a ghost of what could have been, but it was undeniably present. It was a declaration. Something existed. Kaelen found his voice, and it was the growl of the Alpha, resonant with a new, terrifying possession. "You see the truth, Ironwood. The bond is recognized. It is alive." He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Elara, the shimmering thread brightening with his movement. "The challenge is void. You have no claim here." Rykard's face contorted with fury. He had been denied his casus belli, publicly shown to be wrong. But he was a cornered, brutal animal. His yellow eyes darted from the fragile, glowing thread to Elara's face, to Kaelen's advancing form. A feeble thread. He roared, desperation turning to malice. A dying ember. Then let us see how it holds under stress. He didn't move toward Kaelen. With a speed that belied his size, he lunged for Elara. Time seemed to slow. Elara saw the brutal intent in his eyes, saw his clawed hand reaching for her throat. She braced. Her own hidden magic, the gentle, growing magic of the veil rising in a defensive instinct. But she never had to use it. A blur of black and silver crossed the space. Kaelen moved not like a king, but like the apex predator he was. He didn't get between Rykard and Elara. He intercepted. His body collided with Rykard's in a crash of muscle and bone that echoed like thunder. The impact sent them both skidding across the stone floor. But in the chaos, Kaelen's hand shot out, not to strike Rykard, but to grab Elara's wrist. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded. The fragile, glowing thread between them detonated into a conflagration of silent light. A shockwave of pure, undiluted sensation blasted through Elara, not pain, but a staggering, all-consuming awareness. It was every sleepless night, every yearning glance, every dream she'd ever stifled fused with the heat of his palm and the roaring, possessive need in his spirit. She felt his rage at Rykard, his terror for her, and beneath it, a yawning, 15-year-deep chasm of hunger that mirrored her own. It was a torrent, and she was drowning in him. Across the bond, now blazing like a newborn star between their connected flesh, she felt Kaelen's reciprocal shock, the shattering of his own iron control as her loneliness, her quiet strength, her hidden fire poured into him. Their eyes locked, hands clasped. The hall, the shouting, the fighting, it all faded to a distant roar. There was only the bond screaming to life after a lifetime of silence, and the devastating, beautiful, terrifying truth in his silver gaze. He had never touched her. Now he couldn't let go. The world was fire and flood. The sensory deluge from Kaelen's touch wasn't emerging. It was an invasion, a beautiful, brutal possession of her every nerve. She felt the coiled, lethal strength in his forearm, the phantom ache of old battle scars she'd only ever seen from a distance, the grinding tension in his jaw. And underneath it, a current so deep and dark it pulled her under, a hunger vast as a winter night, a yearning that mirrored her own with such precision it stole her breath. 15 years. It echoed between them, a shared sentence. Then, the raw, red fury not just at Rykard, but at the situation, at himself, at the bomb that had chosen this moment of public peril to roar into life. It was too much. Elara's knees buckled. Kaelen's grip on her wrist tightened, becoming an anchor. He didn't just hold her up. He pulled her roughly behind him, using his own body as a shield between her and the scrambling combat that had erupted. Rykard's warriors had surged forward, met by the swift, brutal efficiency of Kaelen's guards. The great hall was now a chaos of snarls, clashing steel, and the sickening crunch of bone. But in the small, charged space around them, there was a violent quiet. Kaelen held her wrist as if it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. His back was to her, a wall of tense leather and muscle, but the connection between them thrummed like a plucked, live wire. Through that blazing, newborn bond, she felt his focus split. The tactical assessment of the fight, the positioning of his men, the threat vectors, and beneath that a single screaming priority. Her. Tauren. Kaelen's roar cut through the din, but the command was transmitted through the bond a fraction of a second before. A pulse of intention she instinctively understood. Clear the west flank. Secure the Queen's exit. She felt rather than saw the captain's acknowledgement. A shift in the pressure of the fight. Rykard was back on his feet, his nose bleeding, his yellow eyes incandescent with rage and humiliation. He didn't look at Kaelen. He looked past him at Elara, his gaze fixated on where Kaelen's hand encircled her wrist. A spark, he spat, blood and saliva flying. A death spasm of a bond too long denied. It proves nothing but your neglect, Kaelen. She is still unclaimed. The word unclaimed vibrated through the bond, hitting Kaelen like a physical blow. A possessive snarl ripped from his throat, low and purely animal. The sound resonated in Elara's own chest. Through their connected skin, a wave of pure, undiluted alpha dominance erupted from him, a pressure that made the very air thicken. Warriors on both sides faltered for a step, a primal instinct to lower their eyes, to bare their throats. She, Kaelen ground out, each word a chip of ice, is mine. The land has witnessed it. The bond has spoken. Your challenge is ash. He finally released her wrist, but only to shift his stance, placing himself more squarely between her and Rykard. The loss of his touch was a shock, a sudden, cold severance that left her trembling. The blazing bridge between them dimmed to a persistent glowing ember in her core. But it was still there, humming, alive. The challenge, Rykard sneered, wiping his mouth, is only beginning. You think this changes anything? A pretty light show. My pack is at your gates. My allies grow restless. They see a veil ripe for the taking, led by a king who sleeps through his own marriage. His eyes flicked to Elara again, a leer in them. I'll enjoy picking up what you've left untouched. A tremor of pure, undiluted fury not hers. His vibrated through the nascent bond. It was a dark, violent tide that promised evisceration. Elara felt the shift in Kaelen a heartbeat before he moved. The rational king receded. The primal alpha surged forward. But Elara moved first. She stepped out from behind Kaelen's shadow, not fully, but enough to be seen. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was sharp, clear, and carried the frost of the highest Veil glaciers. You speak of the land, Alpha Rykard. You speak of natural law. She lifted her chin, the mithril circlet cold on her brow. Then you know the law of guest right. You stand in this hall under its ancient protection. You have broken it by bringing violence before presenting your grievance. You have broken it by threatening your host's mate. The land does not favor oathbreakers. Your challenge is not just void. It is forsaken. A ripple went through the hall, even among the fighting men. Guest right was sacred, older than pack, older than crown. Rykard had, in his blustering aggression, disregarded it. The ironwood alpha's face mottled with rage. He had been outmaneuvered, first by the bond's flicker, now by law. He was losing face, and a wolf like him could only respond one way. You dare quote laws at me, you fibred. Enough. Kaelen's single word was a thunderclap of finality. He didn't shout. The power in it was absolute, woven with the authority of the Alpha King and the fresh, crackling energy of the recognized bond. Your guest right is revoked. You have until the count of 10 to leave my hall, and by sunrise to be beyond my borders. Any of your men who remain will be considered invaders and dealt with accordingly. He took a step forward, and the guards, sensing the shift, formed a solid wall of steel and snarls behind him. One. Rykard seethed, his body trembling with the need to shift, to fight. He looked from Kaelen's implacable face to Elara's icy composure, to the disciplined ranks of the Silver Veil Guards, now fully in control of the hall's exits. The cost of a fight here, now, was annihilation for him and his small contingent. This isn't over, Kaelen, he hissed, the promise dripping venom. You've nursed a weakness for 15 years. You cannot seal a crack this deep with one pretty speech from your trinket queen. The North remembers, and the North is hungry. 2, Kaelen said, his voice devoid of all emotion. With a final, hate-filled glare that lingered on Elara, Rykard spat on the floor again, a deliberate final desecration. He jerked his head at his warriors. "We go!" The retreat was sullen and bristling with violence held in check. The hall doors groaned open, and the hostile pack was swallowed by the night, leaving behind a heavy silence, the scent of blood and anger, and the thrumming aftermath of seismic change. Kaelen did not watch them go. His gaze was fixed on Elara. The moment the doors boomed shut, the rigid authority drained from his posture, replaced by a tension that was somehow more dangerous. The bond between them, no longer screaming, now pulsed with a low, insistent ache. A shared shock, a mutual exposure that was profoundly more intimate than any physical touch they'd never shared. "The royal wing," he said to Torin, his eyes still locked on hers. "Double the guard. Post sentries at every junction. No one enters or leaves without my direct order." "Yes, my king." Torin's gaze flickered between his sovereign and his queen, a new, wary respect in his eyes. He began barking orders, clearing the hall of all but the most essential guards. They were alone in the center of the vast space, surrounded by the evidence of violence, the air still vibrating with shouted threats and the ghost of the luminous thread that had bound them. The curious, fearful eyes of the court were gone. It was just them and the deafening truth. Kaelen closed the distance between them in 3 swift strides. He didn't touch her. He stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the flecks of darker silver in his irises, could see the pulse hammering at the base of his throat. The dormant scent of him was now a living, breathing thing around her, in her. "What?" he said, his voice a raw scrape. "Were you thinking?" The question held no royal command. It was purely personal, laced with a frustration that bordered on agony. "I was thinking," Elara replied, her own voice surprisingly steady despite the storm inside her, "that I would not be the cause of a war waged in whispers. I would not let you slaughter him and bear that weight for my sake. The truth had to be seen. The truth almost got you killed." The control he'd maintained in front of Rykard shattered. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "You walked into a challenge ring. You exposed yourself to that filth. I gave you a command to stay safe." "I am not a soldier to follow your commands, Kaelen. I am your queen." She met his furious gaze, the ember in her core flaring with her own long-suppressed fire. "For 15 years I have stayed safe. I have stayed quiet. I have stayed in my place. And where did it leave us? With a vial of bitterroot and an alpha at our gates calling me a trinket." She took a shuddering breath, the weight of the velvet robe suddenly oppressive. "You told me to survive this. I was trying to survive. In a way that didn't leave our kingdom in ashes." He flinched as if struck. The word, "this" hung between them, charged with the confession from his bedchamber. The wanting, the fury in his eyes banked, replaced by a bleak, weary turmoil that was far worse. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. The queen in her ceremonial armor, yes, but also the woman who had stood alone before 2 rival alphas. The woman whose hidden strength had just shifted the course of a political crisis. The woman whose loneliness he had felt, like a reflection of his own, in that devastating, blinding moment of connection. Elara. Her name on his lips was a broken thing. He lifted a hand, as if to touch her face, but stopped a hair's breadth from her skin. The air between his fingers and her cheek crackled. He closed his eyes, a wave of pure, agonized conflict rolling off him and through the bond. It was the same conflict she'd sensed in his chamber, but magnified 1,000-fold by the bond's awakening. When he opened his eyes, the king was back, but it was a fractured mask. "The bond, what you did. It forced it to the surface. It is active now. It will not go quietly back to sleep." She knew. She could feel it. A second heartbeat alongside her own, tethered to the rhythm of his. "I know. It changes everything," he said. And it was a warning. And nothing. He finally let his hand fall back to his side. The rejection a fresh, familiar wound even now. Rykard was wrong about many things. But he was right about one. This connection. It is a weakness my enemies will exploit. They felt it ignite. They will know it can be targeted. The cold reality of his words doused the last of the adrenaline's warmth. He wasn't speaking of love, or claiming, or the end of their long solitude. He was speaking of strategy, of a newly exposed flank. The bond was not a blessing to him. It was a liability that had just been paraded before his foes. The ache in her chest, so briefly alight with something like hope, crystallized into a sharper, more familiar pain. "So what is your command now, my king?" she asked, the title a shield. "Shall I return to my chambers? Shall we both take a draught to silence this weakness once more?" A low growl escaped him, involuntary. The sound vibrated in her own throat. "Do not," he said. The words strained, "tempt me." The double meaning hung in the air, thick and potent. Before either could speak again, Torin approached, his expression grim. "My king, my queen, the council demands an audience. They are agitated. They have heard of the challenge, of the display." His eyes flickered to the space between Kaelen and Elara, as if he could still see the ghost of the silver-gold thread. Kaelen's expression shut down completely, becoming the impenetrable mask of the sovereign. "The council can wait until dawn." "They insist, sire. Lord Varian is saying the stability of the realm is at stake. That the nature of the bond must be formally addressed to prevent further challenges." Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hall's cold air. The political repercussions were already coiling around them like vipers. Her moment of courage had not solved their problems. It had merely exchanged one set for another, more complicated ones. Kaelen's gaze swept back to her. In his eyes she saw the calculation, the burden, the relentless pressure. And beneath it, a flicker of that same desperate, hungry want, now amplified by the bond's voice, screaming to be fed. "Go to your chambers," he said, his voice flat. "The guards will see you there. I will deal with the council." It was a dismissal. A return to the old patterns, even as the ground between them had fundamentally split open. She was to be sequestered while he managed the fallout. Elara nodded, her dignity the last fortress she had left. She turned, the heavy velvet robe sweeping the floor. As she took her first step away, his voice stopped her low, meant only for her. "And Elara, the draft." He paused, and the silence was heavier than any confession. "There will be no more vials." She didn't look back. She couldn't. The words were not a promise of warmth, of a shared bed. They were a statement of grim fact. The chemical barrier was gone. The only thing left between them now was the terrifying, living, breathing force of the bond itself, and the 15 years of silence it had to break through. She walked away from him, feeling the new, fragile thread between them stretch taut with every step. A tether of light and longing and unspeakable hurt. It did not pull her back to him. It simply was. A connection that could no longer be denied. And a future that had never seemed more perilously uncertain. The walk to the royal wing was a journey through a gauntlet of stairs. The guards posted along the corridors were the same men who had stood indifferent to her solitary comings and goings for years. Now, their gazes held a new, prickling intensity. They had seen the shimmer in the air. They had felt the pulse of the Alpha's claim. She was no longer just the distant moon-crowned queen. She was the woman at the center of the king's furious, public protection. She was the exposed nerve of the kingdom. Elara felt every glance like a physical touch, and she hated it. She kept her head high, her spine straight, the picture of glacial composure. But inside, the bond was a frantic, fluttering thing. With each step away from Kaelen, the connection didn't fade. It thrummed with a low-grade distress, a silent echo of the conflict she'd left boiling in the great hall. She felt the distant, muffled pressure of his anger as he faced the council, a storm contained behind stone walls. It was invasive. It was overwhelming. And it was the most alive she had felt in 15 years. Her chambers, when she finally reached them, were not a sanctuary. They were a gilded cage she knew intimately. The silvery moonlight she'd always found comforting now felt cold, illuminating the spacious emptiness. The large, canopied bed, forever unslept in by her husband, seemed to mock her. She shrugged off the heavy ceremonial robe, letting it fall in a pool of midnight blue on the floor, and stood in her simple underdress, shivering. No more vials. His words reverberated in the quiet. They were a revocation of the old peace treaty, the silent agreement that had allowed them to coexist in sterile courtesy. What replaced it? A raw, untamed connection that felt like holding a lightning bolt in her bare hands. A connection he clearly saw as a strategic disaster. A soft knock at the door made her jump. Enter. It was Lysandra, her senior handmaiden, and the closest thing to a friend within the palace walls. Lysandra's wise, dark eyes took in Elara's state, the pale face, the trembling hands, the discarded robe in a single glance. She carried a tray with a steaming pot of moonbloom tea, and a small honey cake. The whole palace is buzzing, my lady, Lysandra said quietly, setting the tray down on a table by the hearth. She didn't ask questions. She simply began to pour the tea, the delicate floral scent a small comfort. The guards are talking of nothing else. A challenge. A light in the hall. Elara sank into a chair, accepting the warm cup. What are they saying, Lyra? Lysandra hesitated, then sat in the chair opposite, her hands folded in her lap. They say the king moved like a demon to shield you. They say he leapt at Alpha Rykard, as if he would tear the world apart to keep him from you. For many, it is a relief. A sign the bond is true, after all. She paused, her gaze gentle but probing. That they also whisper that the thread was faint, that it only appeared when he touched you. They wonder why, if the bond is true, it has been invisible for so long. Elara took a sip of the too-hot tea, letting it scald her tongue. The truth was a barbed knot in her throat. They wonder what we have been hiding. Have you? Lysandra's question was barely a whisper. Elara looked into the fire. We have been hiding from each other. The admission, voiced aloud to another person for the first time, was both a relief and a humiliation. He used a sleeping draught every night to suppress the bond. Lysandra's breath caught. A flicker of deep, empathetic pain crossed her face. Oh, my lady, it's over now, Elara said, the words tasting of ashes. The draught, the hiding, the bond is awake, and it is a problem he must now manage. Is that all it is to you? Lysandra asked softly. A problem? The question hung in the air. Elara closed her eyes, and instantly she was back in the hall, feeling the shocking, consuming wave of him. His strength, his fury, his hunger. That moment of connection had been the most profound experience of her life. It had been a homecoming to a place she'd never been. No, she whispered, the word a confession to the flames. It is not just a problem. In the council chamber, the air was thick with censure and fear. Kaelen stood at the head of the long obsidian table, his palms flat on the cold stone surface. He had not sat. To sit would be to concede a degree of calm he did not possess. The bond was a live coal in his chest, a constant, distracting pull toward the wing where Elara now was. It screamed at him to go to her, to ensure her safety with his own presence, to settle the frantic energy between them. He locked his muscles against the instinct. "The fact remains, Your Majesty," droned Lord Varian, the oldest and most traditional of his advisers, a wolf whose human form was as grey and gnarled as an ancient tree. "The display, while dramatic, has created a crisis of perception. The bond's dormancy was an open secret we managed. Its awakening is a wild variable. Rykard will not be the last to test it." "The bond's awakening," Kaelen said, his voice dangerously quiet, "saved us from a war tonight. Rykard's challenge was predicated on its falseness. He was proven wrong before the entire court." "Was he?" This from General Goran, a blunt, scarred warrior who commanded the border legions. "With respect, sire, the thread was a wisp. It appeared only on contact. It is not the deep, constant tether of a true, cemented mating. It is the bond in its infancy or in its death throes. Our enemies will see it as vulnerability, not strength. They will ask, why now? Why only a thread? What has been lacking for 15 years? The question was a dagger aimed at his most secret failure. Kaelen felt the collective, unspoken judgment of the men around the table. They knew. They had always known. They had accepted a sterile political union for the sake of peace. They were not prepared to deal with the messy, volatile reality of a real one. "What has been lacking is none of your concern," Kaelen growled, the alpha tone slipping into his voice. The candles in their sconces flickered. "The bond is recognized. It is active. That is the new reality. Our strategy must adapt to protect it." "To protect her," Varian corrected gently, insidiously. "The bond is a weakness so long as it is tied to a single, physically vulnerable point. Queen Elara is beloved by the Veil, yes. But she is not a warrior. She is a target. And now, she is a target with a string attached directly to you, my king. They hurt her. They hurt you. They control her. They influence you." The brutal logic was inescapable. It was the fear that had driven him to the sleeping draft in the first place. To care was to have a weakness. To be bound was to be shackled. He had spent a decade and a half building walls against this exact scenario, and she had shattered them all with one act of reckless courage. "What is your counsel, then?" Kaelen asked, the words gritted out. "Shall I lock her in a tower? Send her back to the Veil? Consummate the bond?" The suggestion came from an unexpected quarter. Lady Selene, the sharp-eyed ambassador from the southern clans, the only other woman at the table. She met Kaelen's startled gaze unflinchingly. "Forgive my bluntness, Your Majesty, but we are past diplomacy. The bond is a wild creature. You have kept it starved. Now it is loose. A fully realized mate bond, cemented and claimed, is not a weakness. It is a source of immense power. It would stabilize the connection. It would make the tether strong, constant, unbreakable. It would broadcast a unified front that even Rykard would not dare challenge. The whisper of a thread is a provocation. The roar of a completed bond is a deterrent." A heated silence fell. Kaelen felt a flush that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. To speak of the most intimate act of claiming in the cold, strategic air of the council chamber felt like a violation. Of her. Of the thing that had just burst to life between them. "You speak of the Queen as if she is a tactical asset to be deployed," he said, his voice like ice. "Is she not?" General Goran countered. "With all due affection for Her Grace, that has always been her primary function. This bond was forged in a treaty, was it not? To unite and bring peace. It is failing in that function because it is incomplete. Complete it. For the stability of the realm. For the stability of the realm." The same justification he had used for the draft. The same cold calculus that had built the wall between them. Now, it was being used to argue for its violent dismantling. The bond in his chest gave a savage, painful throb, a mix of longing and revolt. The idea of claiming her, of finally answering the hunger that had haunted him for 15 years, was a temptation so profound it shook him to his core. But to do it like this, as a political maneuver, as a solution to a problem, it would be a different kind of violation. It would reduce that stunning, terrifying moment of connection in the hall to a mere prerequisite of statecraft. No, Kaelen said. The word final. The council members stared at him. The bond will be protected, he continued, pushing away from the table. The Queen's security will be paramount. But the nature of our connection is not a matter for this council. It is between the Queen and myself. You will adapt your strategies to account for the bond's existence. You will not speak of its consummation again. Is that understood? The authority in his voice brooked no argument. They bowed their heads, murmuring assent, but the dissatisfaction in the room was a tangible fog. He stormed from the chamber, the bond pulling him like a lodestone toward the royal wing. The council's words echoed in his head, mingling with the memory of Elara's grey eyes in the hall full of a courage he hadn't known she possessed, and a hurt he had caused. He reached the doors to her antechamber. The 2 guards stationed there straightened immediately, but he waved them back. He stood there, his hand raised to knock, feeling the bond pulse between them through the thick wood. He could feel her wakefulness, a quiet, sad alertness. He could almost smell the moonbloom tea. What was he doing here? What could he possibly say? The council thinks I should claim you to secure the border. I still want you so much it feels like dying. I'm sorry about the vial. I'm sorry for everything. He lowered his hand. He was the Alpha King. He had just faced down a challenge and a mutinous council. Yet, outside his wife's door, he was paralyzed. Inside, Elara felt the sudden, intense presence on the other side of the door. The bond, which had been a low hum, suddenly crescendoed, singing with his proximity, his conflict, his exhaustion. He was right there. Not in a council chamber, not across a hall. Just a few inches of oak away. She rose from her chair by the dying fire, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a step toward the door, then stopped. She remembered the dismissal in his eyes after the challenge. The strategic calculation. A weakness my enemies will exploit. Was he here to further secure his asset? To lay down new rules for their newly problematic connection? The silence stretched. She could feel him hesitating. The most powerful wolf in the kingdom, hesitating at her door. It was the most intimate thing that had ever passed between them. Then, she felt it a wave of such profound, weary loneliness through the bond that it stole her breath. It was not the king's loneliness. It was Kaelen's. It was the man who had sentenced himself to a lifetime of solitude, and who now stood trapped by the very thing he'd tried to suppress. Without thinking, driven by an instinct older than pride or strategy, she closed the final distance and placed her palm flat against the door, on her side. On the other side, Kaelen jolted as if shocked. He felt the echo of her touch through the bond, a soft pressure against the turmoil in his chest. He hadn't sensed her approach. The bond was too new, too chaotic. But he felt her now, her quiet resolve, her empathy, her unspoken question. He stared at the wood, imagining her hand mirroring his own just a few inches away. The urge to blast the door open, to pull her into his arms, to finally answer the wanting that was tearing him apart, was a tidal wave. But the council's words were a chain, a target, a vulnerability. Complete it for the realm. He could not touch her. Not like this. Not when his own motives were a tangled snarl of duty, fear, and a desire so long denied it had become a monster. He took a step back, breaking the fragile, unseen connection. The bond cried out in protest, a sharp, silent keen of loss. Elara felt him withdraw. The warmth on her palm vanished, replaced by the cold wood. The loneliness in the bond didn't recede. It intensified, now flavored with a bitter, self-directed anger. Then, she heard his footsteps, heavy and deliberate, walking away down the corridor. She slid down to sit with her back against the door, drawing her knees to her chest. The tears, held back through the challenge, through the council's implied verdict, through the sheer shock of the bond, finally came. They were silent, shaking things. She cried for the 15 years of silence. She cried for the vial. She cried for the beautiful, terrible thread of light. And she cried because he had come to her door and he had left. The bond, that new and fragile thing, lay across her heart, thrumming with a shared, unspoken ache. It was awake. It was real. And it was the loneliest she had ever felt. Dawn crept into Elara's chambers not with gentle light, but with a pale, sickly greyness that did nothing to warm the stone. She had not slept. She had sat against the door until her tears ran dry, and her limbs grew stiff with cold, listening to the bond's silent lament. It was a restless, grieving thing, echoing the hollow space where his presence had been, and then vanished. Lysandra found her there at first light, her face a mask of quiet concern. Without a word, she helped Elara to her feet, guided her to the bathing chamber, and poured warm, scented water over her shoulders, washing away the residue of the night's tears and terror. The maid's capable hands were a grounding kindness, a reminder of a world that existed outside the volatile tether in her chest. "The king has called for you," Lysandra said softly, as she braided Elara's still damp hair with more care than usual. In the sunstone throne room, an hour past dawn. Elara's stomach clenched. The formal throne room, not his chambers, not the council room. A public audience. For what purpose? It was not said, my lady, but the summons came from Captain Torin himself. He looked grim. Grim. Elara closed her eyes. After the intimacy of his nearness at her door, after the shared, silent confession of loneliness, a formal summons felt like a slap. The king was reasserting the distance. The bond between them gave a thin, pained pulse, as if in agreement. She dressed in a gown of dove-grey silk, high-necked and long-sleeved, a deliberate armour of modesty. The mithril circlet felt heavier than ever. When she was ready, she looked like the perfect, untouchable queen of yesterday. No one would guess that a thread of living magic connected her heart to a man who had walked away. The walk to the throne room was a repetition of the previous night's gauntlet. But in the harsh light of day, the stairs felt more assessing, less awed. The story of the challenge, the thread, the king's fury, had solidified into palace lore overnight. She was a figure of newfound fascination, and she sensed pity. The great doors to the throne room swung open. The room was not packed with courtiers, but it was far from empty. Key members of the council were present. Lord Varian, General Goran, Lady Celine. Captain Torin stood at rigid attention near the dais, and on the sunstone throne, carved from a single block of amber-coloured rock that glowed in the morning light, sat Kaelen. He was the picture of sovereign power, crown of office upon his brow, formal robes of black and silver, his expression carved from the same impassive stone as his throne. His silver eyes tracked her entrance, but they gave away nothing. The bond, however, was not so controlled. As she approached, it woke from its mournful thrum into a sharp, alert tension. She felt the rigid control he was exerting, a wall he was mentally slamming down between them. It hurt, that conscious rejection through their very connection. She stopped at the prescribed distance before the dais and gave a shallow, correct curtsy. "My king, you summoned me." "Queen Elara." His voice was flat, carrying through the silent hall. Events of last night have necessitated a reassessment of security protocols. For your safety and for the stability of the realm. He spoke as if reading from a scroll. Elara's heart sank like a stone. Alpha Rykard's challenge, while repelled, has revealed a vulnerability. He paused, the word hanging in the air. The awakened bond, while a testament to the treaty's truth, presents a unique tactical risk. It is the opinion of this council that your security must be integrated more directly with the Crown's defense. He gestured, and Torin stepped forward. Captain Torin will now be personally responsible for your security detail. You will have a guard of 4 rotating at all times. Your movements outside the royal wing will be reported and logged. For your own protection, unscheduled travel beyond the palace grounds is suspended until the threat from the Ironwood and its potential allies is neutralized. Each sentence was a bar on a new cage. More visible guards. Scrutiny of her movements. Confinement. She was to be put under house arrest, dressed up as protection. The humiliation burned, sharper for the memory of the courage she'd shown in this very room. Furthermore, Kaelen continued, his gaze never leaving her face, though she felt him pushing the bond down, into a box. To mitigate the risk of the bond being used as a weapon against the Crown, we will begin a regimen of bonding exercises. A flicker of confusion broke through her numbness. Exercises? Lord Varian cleared his throat. With the Queen's permission, we have consulted the archives. There are historical precedents for managing a politically sensitive bond. Meditative techniques. Controlled, non-physical proximity rituals. Designed to strengthen the bond's resilience from external manipulation, and to allow both parties to learn to shield its output from enemy perception. They wanted to train their bond, like training a hound, to make it sit, stay, and not bark at strangers. The absurdity of it clashed violently with the raw, living truth of what she had felt when he touched her. You wish us to practice our connection? Elara asked, her voice dangerously quiet. We wish to fortify it, Kaelen corrected, finally showing a flicker of something impatience. A weak, erratic bond is more dangerous than no bond at all. A strong, controlled bond can be an asset. These sessions will begin today, supervised by Lady Selene, who has studied such law. Supervised. They would have a chaperone for their intimacy. The final indignity. Elara looked at Kaelen, trying to find the man who had whispered mine, with such possessiveness, the man whose loneliness had brushed against hers through a door. She saw only the king, barricaded behind duty and fear. The bond ached with a conflict that mirrored her own, a fierce, rebellious heat smothered by layers of cold control. She had no choice. To refuse would be to defy the king in open court, to play into the narrative of the bond as a destabilizing force. She bowed her head, the submission tasting like gall. As my king commands. The first session will be in the map room following this audience, Lady Selene said, her tone brisk and practical. We will start with grounding and shielding techniques. The audience was clearly over. Kaelen gave a curt nod of dismissal. Elara turned, her spine so straight it felt it might crack, and walked back down the long aisle, feeling his gaze on her back like a weight, and feeling, through the bond, the tumultuous storm he was locking away behind a wall of stone. He was hurting her to protect her. He was confining her to secure her. The logic was impeccable, and it was breaking something inside her that the 15 years of silence had not been able to touch. The map room was a vast circular chamber lined with shelves holding scrolled charts and astrolabes. A great table of polished walnut dominated the center, inlaid with a detailed map of the Silver Vale and its surrounding territories. It was a room of strategy and cold intellect, the worst possible place for what was to come. Lady Selene was already there, along with a severe-looking woman introduced as Master Alice. a lawkeeper from the archives. Two stone-faced guards took up positions inside the doors. Elara stood by the table, her hands clasped tightly before her. When Kaelen entered, the air changed. It wasn't just his physical presence. It was as if the bond, suppressed during the audience, suddenly surged to meet itself. A riptide of awareness pulling between them. He had changed out of his formal robes into simpler, dark clothes. But he looked no more approachable. He didn't look at her. "We begin with proximity," Lady Selene announced, as if commencing a military drill. "The foundation of shielding is mutual awareness without entanglement. You will stand facing each other, a distance of 5 paces. You will open the bond, consciously, and then you will each attempt to build a mental wall around your own emotional output, while remaining aware of the other's presence. The goal is not to sever, but to insulate." It was an obscene parody of connection. Alara's cheeks heated. Kaelen's jaw tightened, but he moved to the spot Selene indicated. Slowly, Elara took her place opposite him, 5 paces of empty, sun-dappled floor between them. "Now," Master Alice instructed, her voice a dry rustle. "Close your eyes. Find the thread of the bond. Do not grasp it. Simply observe it as a road between your citadels." Elara closed her eyes. She didn't need to search. The bond was there. A vibrant, aching cord stretched taut across the space between them. It hummed with his suppressed energy frustration, a deep-seated anger, and underneath, a current of something dark and sweet and frantic that she knew was his hunger. Feeling it so directly, without the buffer of anger or crisis, was overwhelming. "Now," Alice continued, "imagine a wall around your own core. Stone, ice, light, whatever symbol holds strength for you. Build it brick by brick. Let nothing out. Let nothing in that you do not consciously permit." Elara tried. She visualized the high, glistening walls of her ancestral home in the Vale, made of moonlight and unmelting frost. She tried to pull her awareness back from the bond, to retreat behind her walls. But the bond wasn't a passive road. It was a living conduit. His emotions leaked through a flash of impatience with this process, a sliver of concern for her obvious distress, and that ever-present tormenting want that echoed her own. She heard a low growl from Kaelen's direction. Her eyes flew open. His was still closed, his brow furrowed in fierce concentration. A fine sheen of sweat had broken out on his temples. She felt his effort, a monumental strain as he tried to force the bond to obey, to become a neat, disciplined thing. But she also felt the bond pushing back, wanting more, not less. It was like trying to dam a river with his bare hands. "Focus, Your Majesty," Selene said sharply to him. "You are broadcasting." "I am aware." Kaelen gritted out, his eyes snapping open. They glowed faintly. They locked with Elara's across the space. In that glance, the practiced walls faltered. For a second, she didn't see the king or the strategist. She saw the man from the bedchamber haunted by wanting. She saw the man who had stood at her door. The bond surged, a sweet, painful rush of recognition. It felt like a sigh after a long breath held. Her carefully constructed wall of ice cracked. A wave of heat, of pure, unguarded need, washed over her from him. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't controlled. It was just his. It stole the air from her lungs. He felt it to the breach. His control shattered. With a sharp, inhaled breath, he took a step forward. Not the 5 paces to close the distance, just one. A single, involuntary step toward her. The movement was small, but in the tense, silent room, it was a quake. Lady Selene and Master Alice exchanged a glance. The guards shifted their weight. Kaelen stopped, physically recoiling as if he'd walked into a blade. He slammed his eyes shut again. his fists clenched at his sides. The bond screamed in protest as he wrenched it back, forcing the chaotic flood of feeling behind a bulwark of sheer, desperate will. The connection didn't break, but it went from a singing clarity to a muffled, painful throb. "Enough," he bit out, his voice ragged. "For today." "Your Majesty, we have only begun," Master Alice started. "I said enough." The alpha command in his voice brooked no argument. He turned on his heel and strode from the room without another glance at Elara, leaving her standing alone in the center of the map room, her own walls in ruins, the bond a bruised and weeping thing in her chest. Lady Selene approached her, her expression unreadable. The first attempt is often the most difficult. The bond resists artificial constraint. It seeks completion. She said the last word with a hint of sympathy that felt worse than criticism. "We will try again tomorrow. I suggest you both spend the interval in solitary meditation, to regain your equilibrium." Elara nodded, unable to speak. Equilibrium. There was no equilibrium. There was only before the touch and after. And in the after, there was a king who was terrified of the very thing that tied them together. And a bond that was dying of thirst in a desert of their own making. As she left the map room, the assigned guards falling into step around her, she felt the bond stretch thin as Kaelen moved farther away. But it didn't quiet. It carried a new resonance from that shattered moment, the echo of his unbidden step, and the devastating, unspoken truth it revealed. He wanted to close the distance, and the fact that he couldn't or wouldn't was tearing him apart just as surely as it was tearing her. Their cage, it seemed, had two prisoners. The palace settled into a tense, watchful rhythm in the days that followed. The memory of Rykard's challenge was a lingering bruise on the kingdom's pride, and the air hummed with unspoken questions about the thread of light and the newly fortified guards around the queen. Elara's world contracted to a series of supervised movements. Her chambers, the private royal garden under doubled guard, and the map room for the daily torment of the bonding exercises. They were a spectacular, silent failure. Each session followed the same pattern. Stiff proximity, closed eyes, the painful, clumsy attempt to shield, the inevitable, violent surge of the bond, raw and hungry, refusing to be tamed into a tactical asset. Kaelen's control was a fraying rope. Elara could feel the strain of it through their connection, a grinding tension that left him irritable and her exhausted. He would last 10 minutes, 20, before the bond would spike with a flash of pure, unfiltered emotion, frustration, self-loathing, that ever-present, desolate want, and he would call an abrupt halt, stalking from the room without a word. The distance between them, enforced by guards and protocol, grew colder even as the bond grew warmer, a constant, low-grade fever in her blood. She learned to sense his moods through it. The dark thundercloud of a difficult council meeting, the sharp focus of a training yard bout, the deep, hollow quiet of the late watches of the night when she knew he was awake, alone, as she was. It was during one of these sleepless nights, a week after the challenge, that the bond did something new. Elara was staring at the canopy of her bed, tracing the embroidered silver constellations. The bond was its usual restless presence, a hum of tangled energy. Then, without warning, it pulled. Not a gentle tug, but a sharp, insistent yank deep in her core. A sensation of sudden, precipitous falling. A gasp tore from her throat as she sat bolt upright, her hand flying to her chest. Accompanying the pull was a blast of sensory information, not emotion, but physical sensation. The bite of cold night air, the rough texture of stone beneath palms, the burn of overtaxed muscles, and a dizzying, terrifying sense of height. Kaelen. He wasn't in his chambers. He was somewhere high, and he was in distress. The bond wasn't conveying pain, exactly, but a reckless, adrenalized intensity that bordered on self-destruction. Without thinking, propelled by an instinct more fundamental than fear or protocol, Elara threw off her covers. She pulled on a heavy cloak over her nightdress and moved to her chamber door. The two guards stationed outside straightened. "My lady?" one asked, his voice thick with sleep. "I need air." The west balcony. It was the closest open space to the royal wing that wasn't the guarded garden. "It is the middle of the night, your grace. The king's orders are for my protection, not my imprisonment," she said, layering her voice with a queen's authority she didn't feel. "I will take the air on the west balcony. You may accompany me to the door." They exchanged a look, but perhaps seeing the unusual pallor of her face, the slight tremor in her hands, they nodded. They flanked her down the silent corridor to the ornate archway that led onto a long, narrow balcony that overlooked the training grounds and the dark sprawl of the lower city beyond. The night was clear and bitterly cold. Elara dismissed the guards to wait inside, claiming a need for solitude. The moment they retreated, she rushed to the balustrade, her eyes scanning the darkness. The bond was a compass needle in her chest, pointing insistently upward and to the left. Her gaze lifted to the highest point of the palace, the ancient, crumbling bell tower. It was a relic, unused for centuries, its stairs considered unsafe, a jagged silhouette against the starry sky. And there, at the very top, on the narrow parapet, she saw a figure, a dark shape against the deeper dark, standing perilously close to the edge. Her heart stopped. The bond yanked again, a visceral pull toward that figure. It was him. She didn't know how he'd gotten up there, or why. But the bond screamed he was balanced on a knife's edge, and not just physically. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She acted without conscious thought. Turning from the balcony, she slipped back inside, past the confused guards with a murmured, "I've taken my air," and moved not toward her chambers, but down a lesser-used servant's stair. She knew the palace's forgotten corners better than anyone. A queen with no husband to occupy her time had often wandered. She knew there was a back way into the tower's base, through a disused herb drawing room. The lower door to the tower was, as she suspected, unlocked, a negligence born of its disuse. The spiral staircase within was narrow, treacherous, and thick with dust and cobwebs. The bond pulled her upward, a guiding, desperate thread. Her soft shoes slipped on the worn stone steps. The air grew colder as she climbed, and the only sound was her own ragged breathing and the frantic drum of her heart. She emerged at last onto the tiny, open parapet. The wind here was a living thing, whipping her cloak and hair around her, stealing her breath. And there he was. Kaelen stood with his back to her, at the very edge, his hands braced on the crumbling stone crenellations. He was shirtless despite the cold, his back a landscape of tense muscle and old scars silvered by moonlight. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. The bond exploded into full, screaming awareness the moment she stepped onto the tower top. He knew she was there. "Go back, Elara." His voice was raw, stripped bare by the wind and something else. She didn't move. "What are you doing up here?" A harsh, humorless sound escaped him. Trying to outrun it. He meant the bond, the wanting, the mess of it all. It doesn't work. The higher you go, the louder it screams. She took a careful step forward, the wind threatening to push her off balance. "It pulled me here. I felt you." "Falling, not falling," he said, still staring out at the sleeping kingdom. "Flying, or wanting to." He finally turned his head, just enough to profile his sharp cheekbone and the faint glow of his eyes in the dark. The draft was a cage. "This?" He gestured vaguely between them, a slash of his hand. "This is a different kind of cage. One with your heartbeat on the other side of the bars." The words were a confession more devastating than any about a vial. He felt imprisoned by his connection to her. The ache in her chest was a physical wound. "You could let me go," she whispered, the wind tearing the words from her lips. "Dissolve the treaty. Send me home to the veil. The bond would fade." It was the logical solution, the one that would free them both. Saying it felt like carving out her own heart. He turned fully then, and the look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated torment. "Do you think I haven't thought of that? 1,000 times. Every day for 15 years. He took a step toward her, away from the edge. The bond sang with the movement. It would mean war with your veil. It would shatter the peace. And it would. He stopped, his voice dropping to a ragged whisper. It would kill something in me that even the draft couldn't touch. He was close now. Close enough that she could see the fevered intensity in his silver eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his bare skin in the cold air. The wind wrapped his scent around her pine, night, wildness, and a desperation that matched her own. Why? The question was torn from her, the core of 15 years of pain. Why the vial? Why the distance? If you felt this? She couldn't say wanted. The word was too small for what vibrated between them on this lonely tower. His control, always so absolute, was in tatters up here in the wind. The bond had them both in its thrall. "Because I saw what a real bond did," he said, the words rushing out like a floodgate breaking. "My parents. It was a madness. A beautiful, all-consuming madness. It made my father reckless. It made my mother a target. She died because an enemy knew hurting her would shatter him, would make him make mistakes." He dragged a hand through his hair. "I became king young, Elara, with enemies on every side. The treaty with your veil was a lifeline. And you were this radiant, gentle thing from a world of moonlight and magic. The bond sparked the moment we met at the signing. I felt it. And I knew if I let it in, if I claimed you, you would become the center of my world. And every enemy I had would see it. They would come for you. And I would burn the world down to save you. And in the burning, I would lose the kingdom I was sworn to protect." He was breathing heavily, his confession hanging between them, more intimate than any touch. The draft was a shield. For you, for the realm, it was the only way I knew to be king and to have you near, without destroying us all with the force of what I felt. The truth, finally spoken, was a labyrinth of tortured nobility and profound selfishness. He had protected her by rejecting her. He had kept her safe by making her lonely. He had chosen his kingdom over his heart, and in doing so, had broken them both. Tears streamed down Elara's face, carried sideways by the wind. "You never asked me," she said, her voice trembling. "You never asked if I was willing to take the risk. You never gave me a choice. You made me a ghost in my own life to suit your strategy." The truth of it hit him like a blow. He flinched. "I thought it was a kindness. It was a prison sentence." The cry was wrenched from her. "For a crime neither of us committed. I have spent 15 years believing I was unworthy, unfixable, when all along, you were just afraid." The word landed in the space between them. Afraid. The mighty Alpha King. He didn't deny it. He just looked at her, his eyes wide with the pain of being seen so completely. "Yes," he breathed. "I was afraid. I am afraid. I am terrified of this." He took the final step, closing the distance until only a hand's breadth separated them. The bond was a conflagration now, a wildfire in her veins. She could feel his heartbeat thundering in time with her own. "I am terrified that if I touch you, I will never be able to stop. That the king will disappear, and there will only be the wolf, and the man, and the wanting. And the world will burn for it." His gaze dropped to her lips. The air crackled. The wind howled around them, but in the small space between their bodies, there was a breathless, charged calm. Every particle of her being leaned toward him. The silent, starving years screamed for an end. Her hand lifted of its own volition, hovering near the side of his face. She didn't touch him. It was an offering. A question. He stared at her hand, his chest heaving. The battle in his eyes was epic duty against desire. Fear against fate. The bond pulled, insistent, undeniable. With a ragged sound that was half groan, half surrender, he turned his face a fraction, pressing his cheek into her open palm. The contact was electric. It was not the desperate, shocking grip of the challenge. It was deliberate, slow, a conscious yielding. His skin was warm and rough with stubble against her palm. The moment stretched, suspended in the high, cold wind. The bond didn't explode this time. It bloomed. A deep, resonant warmth spread from the point of contact, flowing through her arm and into her chest. A golden, honeyed light that soothed the raw, torn edges of her soul. It was recognition. It was acceptance. It was a homecoming. A shudder racked his frame. He closed his eyes, his own hand coming up to cover hers, pressing it more firmly against his face. His breath hitched. For a long, timeless moment, they stood there on the edge of the world, connected by a single tremulous touch, the bond singing a quiet, triumphant song. Then, a shout from far below, faint on the wind. Fire! In the lower city! To the gates! The spell shattered. Kaelen's eyes flew open, the king slamming back into place. He dropped her hand as if scalded, stepping back, his expression closing off, though the bond still vibrated with the echo of that profound connection. "You need to go inside," he said, his voice already hardening into command. "Now, get to your chambers. Lock the door. Kaelen. Now, Elara." It was the Alpha's voice, brooking no argument. The moment of vulnerability was gone, buried under the imminent threat. This is not a coincidence. A challenge, then a fire. They are testing us, probing the weaknesses. His eyes, glowing in the dark, held hers for one more second, and in them she saw the true cost of his fear. "The weakness is me, when I am with you." He turned and was gone, disappearing down the dark tower stairs, leaving her alone with the freezing wind, the scent of smoke beginning to taint the air, and the ghost of his warmth still imprinted on her palm. The bond so briefly at peace now throbbed with a new kind of alarm, not for his physical safety, but for the fragile, beautiful thing that had just for a moment dared to unfurl between them only to be crushed once more by the weight of the crown. The warmth from Kaelen's cheek lingered on Elara's palm like a brand as she stumbled down the dark, treacherous stairs of the bell tower. It was a phantom touch, already fading, but the echo of it reverberated through the bond, a poignant counterpoint to the sharpening town of smoke in the air, and the rising cacophony from the lower city. By the time she reached the base, the palace was no longer sleeping. Shouts echoed through stone corridors, the rhythmic thud of armored boots headed for the gates, and the distant, ominous glow of orange painted the night sky beyond the high windows. Chaos, the very thing Kaelen had spent a lifetime trying to wall out, was now at their doorstep, and she had been on a crumbling tower, sharing a moment of devastating intimacy. She slipped back into her chambers to find Lysandra already there, her face pale with worry. "My lady, thank the moons. The guards said you'd gone to the balcony, but when the alarm sounded—" "I needed air," Elara said, a lie tasting stale. She went to the window, pulling aside the heavy drape. From here, she could see the source of the glow, not one fire, but several, scattered through the artisans' quarter near the eastern wall. Contained, it seemed, but deliberately set. A diversion. A message. Testing the weaknesses. "The king has gone to the walls," Lysandra said, following her gaze. Captain Torin has ordered the royal wing sealed. No one in or out until the all clear. Sealed. Elara's fingers tightened on the drape. While he faced the threat, she was to be locked away. The precious, vulnerable asset. The irony was a bitter pill. Up on the tower, for a fleeting moment, she had felt like his equal, his confidant. Now, she was back in her gilded box. But the bond was different now. It thrummed with a new layer of awareness. She could feel Kaelen's location not just as a direction, but as a locus of intense, focused energy. He was on the eastern battlement, a fixed point of controlled fury amid the swirling chaos below. She felt the rapid calculations, the deployment of guards, the cold assessment of the fire's patterns. And underneath the king's martial focus, she felt the wolf's agitation, its instinct to be down there, in the thick of the threat, not observing from a height. She felt its frustration at being leashed by duty. And she felt something else, faint but undeniable, a thread of that same golden warmth from the tower, a subconscious anchor line he'd cast back toward her, ensuring through the bomb that she was safe, that she was there. It was a silent vigil he was keeping, even as he managed a crisis. He was multitasking, and one of those tasks was her. The realization sent a strange, defiant thrill through her. She was not just a passive recipient of his protection. She was a presence in his mind, a part of his strategic field. For the first time, the bond felt less like a shackle and more like a partnership, a terrifying, unsteady, and involuntary partnership, but a connection that went both ways. "Bring me my darker cloak, Lyra," Elara said, turning from the window. "The one without the silver threading." Lysandra blinked. "My lady, we are to remain here." "I am not leaving the wing," Elara said, her mind racing. "But I will not sit and stare at the walls. If I am to be a strategic point, I should understand the board." She had spent years studying history, treaty law, the agricultural yields of the Vale. It was time to apply that mind to the immediate, muddy reality of defense. She moved to a small writing desk and pulled out a clean piece of parchment and a charcoal stick. "You have cousins in the city guard, do you not? And friends among the chambermaids who hear things?" Lysandra, catching her queen's intent, nodded slowly, a spark of understanding in her eyes. "I do." "Good. The guards at our door will have contact with the runners. We cannot leave, but information can come in. I want to know everything, not the official reports for the king's ears. The rumors on the stairs, which gates are reinforced, where the wounded are being taken. If anyone was seen near the fires before they started, it was a small rebellion, a quiet claiming of agency. She could not fight the fires, but she could map them. She could not stand on the wall, but she could understand it. As Lysandra went to the door to subtly query the guards, Elara began to sketch from memory a rough layout of the lower city's eastern quarter, marking the locations of the glowing patches in the sky. The bond hummed in her chest, a live feed to Kaelen's tension. She could feel the moment he spotted something, a tightening of focus, a spike of alertness. She marked a corresponding area on her map, near the tanneries by the river, a potential access point or a secondary target. For over an hour they worked, Lysandra ferrying whispers, Elara cross-referencing, building a picture of a coordinated, but curiously non-lethal, attack. The fires were in warehouses storing non-essential goods. The City Watch had responded swiftly. No lives lost, minimal injuries. It was harassment, a flexing of muscle. A probe, just as Kaelen had said. But a probe for what? The answer came not from the city, but from the bond. A sudden, violent twist of alarm, sharp, personal, and laced with a protectiveness so fierce it stole Elara's breath. It wasn't about the city anymore. It was closer. She dropped her charcoal. "Lyra." The door. They both listened. The two guards were still outside, their low murmurs audible. But from somewhere down the corridor, in the direction of the king's empty chambers, came a different sound. A faint, metallic scrape. Out of place in the sealed, guarded wing. The bond screamed a warning. Elara was on her feet, her heart hammering. Kaelen's alarm was a beacon, pulling at her. But he was too far away, tied down at the walls. His fear was for her. The probe hadn't been just at the gates. It was here, inside. The hidden passage, she breathed. The memory of the night of the challenge flashing back. The passage from Kaelen's chamber to the gallery. If she knew of it, others in the palace's long history might. Another scrape, closer. Not from the main corridor. From within the walls themselves. Lysandra's eyes were wide with fear. Elara's mind raced. To call the guards would alert the intruder, who might flee or attack. The passage exit was in Kaelen's antechamber. If someone was in there. A cold, clear certainty settled over her. This was the real test. Not the fires, this getting to her. Using her to get to him. She couldn't be the weakless cowering in her room. Stay here, she whispered to Lysandra. Bar the door behind me. Do not open it unless you hear my voice or the king's. My lady, you can't. I have to. The bond was a drumbeat of urgency in her blood. She felt Kaelen's growing, frantic distraction on the wall, his attention splitting as the bond shrieked of danger near her. He would come. He would tear himself away from his duty and come. And that might be the goal, to pull the king from the wall during a crisis. She had to see. She had to know. Silent as a shadow, Elara slipped out of her chamber door, nodding calmly to the two guards. I am going to the king's study to fetch a book. I cannot sleep. It was a flimsy pretext, but her queenly demeanour held. They nodded, one moving to accompany her. I require solitude, she said, layering her voice with a touch of the distant, moon-touched authority her Vale lineage granted her. The guard hesitated, then acquiesced, staying at his post. The royal wing was sealed. Where could she go? She walked quickly down the corridor, not to the study, but to the door of Kaelen's antechamber. It was unguarded. He was not in residence. Her hand trembled as she turned the handle. It was unlocked. The room was dark, lit only by the embers of a dying fire. It was steeped in his scent-old books, leather, pine, kingly solitude. The bond swelled, painful and sweet in the familiar space. The metallic scrape came again, louder now, from the far wall where a tapestry of the great wolf Fenrir hung. The hidden door behind it. Elav's eyes darted around the room. A heavy, bronze candlestick stood on a side table. She hefted it. It was crude, inelegant, a far cry from the subtle magic of her heritage, but it was weighty and real. She moved to the side of the tapestry, her back to the stone wall, the candlestick raised. Her breath was shallow, the bond a silent scream of connection to a man too far away to help. The tapestry twitched. Then, with a soft sigh of disused hinges, a narrow section of the wall swung inward. A figure slipped out, silhouetted against the deeper black of the passage. He was dressed in dark, close-fitting clothes, not palace livery. He moved with a prowling certainty, scanning the room. His gaze swept past her shadowed niche, then snapped back. Elara didn't hesitate. As he lunged, she swung the candlestick with all her strength. It connected with a sickening thud against his shoulder, not his head. He grunted, more in surprise than pain, and whirled, a short, wicked blade appearing in his hand, catching the faint firelight. The bond in her chest erupted into pure, undiluted panic. Not hers, Kaelen's. He felt her fear, saw through the bond's vague impression the glint of steel in the dark. A roar of pure, unthinking rage echoed down the connection, so vivid she almost heard it in the room. Distantly, From the direction of the walls, an actual answering wolf's howl tore through the night. The intruder's eyes, visible now as they adjusted, widened. He wasn't looking at her weapon. He was looking at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "The thread," he murmured, his voice rough with a northern accent. "Ironwood. It's true. You're really tied to him." He didn't attack. He took a step back, his gaze darting to the door to the corridor. His mission wasn't assassination. It was confirmation. Infiltration. To see the lay of the royal chambers. To verify the rumors of the bond. And perhaps to plant a seed of fear. "He's coming for you," the man said, a nasty smile touching his lips. The mighty king, abandoning his wall for his little queen. How predictable. That was the goal. To make Kaelen predictable. To use her as a lever. Rage, hot and clean, washed through Elara, burning away the fear. She adjusted her grip on the candlestick. "He is your king," she said, her voice like chips of ice. "And you are a rat in his walls." She didn't wait for him to move. She charged, not at his blade, but at his balance, using the clumsy weight of the candlestick as a battering ram against his midsection. It was a desperate, unskilled move, but it was fueled by a lifetime of quiet strength and the roaring power of the bond, which sang with Kaelen's frantic, approaching energy. The intruder, off balance, stumbled back toward the open hidden door. He snarled, slashing with the blade. She felt a searing line of fire across her upper arm, a hot wetness instantly soaking her sleeve. The pain was sharp, bright. It echoed down the bond and was met with a psychic howl of agony and fury so profound it blurred her vision. The antechamber door exploded inward. Kaelen filled the doorway, chest heaving, his eyes molten silver in the dark. He smelled of smoke and night air and killing rage. He took in the scene, the intruder, the hidden door, Elara holding a bloody arm, the candlestick clattering to the floor in a nanosecond. The intruder made a break for the passage. He never made it. Kaelen moved with a speed that defied physics. There was no elegant duel. It was pure, brutal predation. One hand snapped out, catching the man's wrist with a crack of breaking bone. The blade fell. The other hand closed around the man's throat, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the stone wall beside the tapestry. The impact shook the room. "Who sent you?" Kaelen's voice was the grinding of continental plates, low and deadly. The man gagged, clawing at the implacable hand. His eyes, bulging, found Elara over Kaelen's shoulder. He tried to speak, to utter another taunt. Kaelen's grip tightened. Wrong answer. He leaned in, his face inches from the intruder's. "You bleed in her presence. You die in this room. Kaelen." Elara's voice was thin but clear. He didn't look at her. His entire world had narrowed to the threat in his hand. The bond was a torrent of violent possession, a red haze that threatened to swallow him whole. "Kaelen, stop." She took a step forward, her injured arm cradled against her. "He's a scout, a probe. Killing him gives us nothing." The logic, spoken in her calm, pained voice, pierced the red haze. He shuddered, the killing light in his eyes flickering. He looked from the choking man to her, to the blood on her sleeve. The conflict was agonizing. The wolf wanted the kill. The king needed information. The man was shattered by the sight of her hurt. With a snarl of immense effort, he loosened his grip just enough for the intruder to drag in a ragged breath. He didn't let go. He turned his head, his glowing eyes finally meeting hers. In that gaze, she saw the tower, the confession, the fear, and now, the terrifying, glorious truth. She was his to protect, and he had nearly failed. The bond between them thrummed, no longer just with want or loneliness, but with a shared ferocious will to survive together. The dungeon, he gritted out, his voice ravaged. He yelled for Torin, who appeared instantly in the shattered doorway with more guards. Kaelen thrust the semi-conscious intruder at them. Interrogate him. I want every name, every signal, every plan. As the man was dragged away, Kaelen turned fully to Elara. The rage drained from him, leaving behind a stark, raw vulnerability. His eyes dropped to her arm. You're bleeding. It's shallow, she said, though the wound stung fiercely. He crossed the space in 2 strides. His hands, which had just been instruments of lethal force, came up, trembling slightly, and hovered over her injured arm. He didn't touch the wound. He didn't touch her. It was as if he was afraid his touch now would break her. The bond swelled with his anguish, his self-recrimination, his desperate need to fix what had been broken. You came, she whispered. His eyes lifted to hers. The silver was dim, human. The bond. It screamed. He swallowed hard. I felt the blade. He had felt her pain. Across the distance, through stone and chaos, he had felt it as his own. Behind them, a hidden passage gaped open. The fires in the city still glowed. The night was full of enemies and tests. But in the wreckage of his antechamber, with her blood on the floor and the scent of his fear in the air, something had irrevocably shifted. The probe had succeeded in one thing. It had proven that the bond was not just a thread of light. It was a lifeline, and it was pulling them together into a storm neither of them could weather alone. He was still afraid, but he was no longer pushing her away. He was standing, shattered, before her, and his fear was now for her, not of her. And that, Elara realized with a heart-clenching certainty, was the beginning of everything. The world narrowed to the searing line of fire on her arm, and the shattered look in Kaelen's eyes. The formal distance of king and queen evaporated in the intimate, violated space of his antechamber. The scent of her blood coppery and sharp mixed with the lingering smoke from the city and his own wild pine and stone fear. It was a brutal, grounding cocktail. Sit, Kaelen said, the word more a strained breath than a command. He guided her, his hands still not quite touching her, to the heavy chair by the dying fire. He moved with a stiff, controlled violence, like a spring coiled too tight. Lysandra! He barked toward the open door where the maid had appeared, pale and wide-eyed. The healer's kit, now, and fetch water and clean linen. Elara sank into the chair, the adrenaline draining away to leave her light-headed and trembling. The cut was indeed shallow, a slice along the muscle of her upper arm, but it bled freely, staining the grey silk of her sleeve a dark, spreading crimson. The pain was a bright, clarifying thread, tethering her to the reality of what had just happened. She had been attacked. In the heart of the palace. Because of him. Because of them. Kaelen knelt before her, his movements jerky. He took the healer's kit from Lysandra with a terse nod, dismissing her with a look. When the door closed, they were alone again. The bond was a live wire of shared shock and simmering fury. Let me see, he said, his voice low. This time, his hands did not hover. They were practical, efficient. He took a pair of shears from the kit, and, with a careful precision that belied the tension in his jaw, cut away the blood-soaked sleeve from shoulder to wrist. The cold air hit the wound, and she flinched. He froze, his fingers inches from her skin. A wave of guilt so profound it was nauseating washed through the bond. I'm sorry, he murmured, not for the cold, but for everything. It's not your fault, she said, but the words sounded hollow. In the brutal calculus of their enemies, it was entirely his fault. She was a target because she was his. He didn't answer. He focused on the task, cleansing the wound with a stinging antiseptic tincture. His touch was clinical, that she felt the tremor in his fingertips, the intense, almost painful focus he exerted to keep them steady. The bond hummed with his internal litany. She is hurt. Because of me. In my home. I was not here. When the wound was clean, revealing an angry red line, he reached for a jar of silvery green salve moonwork paste. From her own veil, his hand hesitated. Applying it was an act of care, of tenderness. It crossed a line from necessary aid into something more intimate. He looked up at her, his eyes asking a silent permission. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His breath hitched. He dipped 2 fingers into the cool salve and began to spread it along the cut. The moment his skin made contact with hers, a different kind of shockwave went through them. It wasn't the violent surge of the challenge or the desperate warmth of the tower. This was quiet, deliberate, a conscious offering of solace. The salve soothed the burning, but his touch ignited something else. A deep, resonant hum started in the center of the bond and radiated outward, a frequency of pure, uncomplicated connection. For a fleeting moment, the fear, the anger, the 15 years of silence all fell away. There was only the cool press of his fingers, the shared rhythm of their breathing, and the golden thread between them, glowing softly in the dim light as if responding to the gentleness. His thumb brushed the unbroken skin beside the wound, a barely there caress. His eyes were locked on his work, but she saw his throat work as he swallowed. The air grew thick, charged with all the things they weren't saying. He finished applying the salve and reached for a roll of clean linen bandage. The spell lingered as he began to wind the cloth around her arm. His movements slow, methodical. Each pass brought his hands closer to her body. His head bent near hers. She could feel the heat of him, smell the night air and sweat and underlying wildness of his skin. He was ironwood, Kaelen said suddenly, his voice a rough scrape, as if speaking broke the dangerous silence. A scout, probably one of Rykard's personal shadows. The passage. It's in the oldest blueprints. I should have had it sealed. I didn't think. He trailed off, his fingers pausing as he tied off the bandage. I didn't think they would dare come for you here. They dared because they believe the bond makes you vulnerable, Elara said softly. Because they believe I am a point of pressure. He finished the knot and let his hands fall, but he didn't move from his kneeling position before her. He looked up, and the raw anguish was back. They're right. The admission hung in the air, a truth more terrifying than any attack. I left the wall, he continued, his voice hollow. The moment I felt your fear, I left. Torin had to take command. The diversion worked. Because of me. Because of this. He gestured weakly between them. You saved me, she countered. At what cost? The question was a plea. What happens next time, Elara? When it's not a scout with a knife, but an army at the gate? When the choice is between you and the kingdom? What do I become then? It was the core of his terror, laid bare. Not just that she would be hurt, but that he would fail. That the king would be destroyed by the man, and the man destroyed by the king. She reached out with her uninjured hand. Slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, she cupped the side of his face, mirroring their moment on the tower. His eyes slid shut, a shudder racking his powerful frame. He leaned into the touch, a silent, profound surrender. You become what you have always been, she whispered, her thumb stroking the harsh line of his cheekbone. A man who carries impossible burdens, but you don't have to carry this one alone anymore. She let the truth she had discovered in the map room, in the tower, settle between them. The bond is not a weakness if we stop fighting it. It's a bridge. He opened his eyes, and the conflict in them was a tempest. A bridge to where? To a world where I am ruled by my heart instead of my head. That world burns, Elara. I have seen it. And this world? She asked, her gaze sweeping the room. The hidden door, the blood on the floor, the isolated silence of 15 years. This world of walls and drafts and lonely duty? That world is already on fire. We've just been too numb to feel the heat. Her words struck a chord. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased a fraction. He turned his head, pressing a kiss into the center of her palm. The gesture was so tender, so utterly unexpected, that her breath caught. The bond sang, a pure, sweet note. "What would you have me do?" he asked against her skin, his voice muffled, defeated. "I cannot unmake the bond. I cannot send you away. I cannot seem to. Stop wanting you. It is a trap with no exit. Stop looking for an exit," she said, her own heart pounding. "Start looking at what's in the trap with you." He went very still. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes searched hers, looking for deception, for strategy, for the political calculation that had governed their every interaction. He found only the same weary courage, the same stubborn hope, that had driven her to stand between two alphas. The knock at the door was like a gunshot. They jerked apart. Kaelen surged to his feet, the vulnerable man vanishing behind the mask of the king, so fast it left Elara dizzy. Enter. It was Torin. The captain's face was grim, etched with soot and fatigue. He took in the scene, the queen bandaged, the king kneeling by her chair just moments before, the intimate proximity, without a flicker of expression. "The fires are contained, sire. Minimal damage. The interrogations have begun. The prisoner is stubborn, but he will talk." His eyes flicked to Elara. "My queen. I am relieved you are safe." "Thank you, Captain," Elara said, drawing her torn robe tighter around her with her good arm. "Report," Kaelen said, moving to stand behind Elara's chair, a protective, possessive stance that was not lost on Torin. The attack was coordinated but cautious. The fires were set with timed igniters, clearly a diversion. The intruder entered through the old river sewer grate, using a route we thought collapsed. He had detailed knowledge of the palace's antiquated layout. Torin paused. "He had help from the inside, sire. Someone provided the schematics, the guard rotations for this wing during a general alert. It was a precision probe. Inside help." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. The enemy wasn't just beyond the walls, it was among them. In the court, among the staff. Someone who knew their secrets, their routines, their vulnerabilities. Kaelen's hand came to rest on the back of Elara's chair, his fingers curling into the carved wood. "Find the leak, Torin. Use whatever means necessary. I want names by dawn." "Yes, sire," Torin bowed. "There is one more thing." The prisoner, before he clammed up, he said something. He said, "The king thinks his secret is safe. But the north knows a barren queen bears no fruit, and a fruitless tree is meant to be cut down." Torin's gaze was apologetic as it settled on Elara. The old shame, the public speculation about her childlessness, now weaponized. It wasn't just about the bond being unconsummated. It was about its perceived infertility. A kingdom needed an heir. A fruitless tree. Her stomach turned to ice. She felt Kaelen's reaction through the bond before she saw it. A surge of such black, murderous rage that the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The wood of the chair creaked under his grip. "Get out," Kaelen said, his voice deadly soft. Torin left swiftly. The silence he left behind was frigid. Elara stared into the embers of the fire, the cruel words echoing in her head. Barren. Fruitless. Cut down. She had endured the whispers for years, but hearing them used as a battle cry from their enemies, was a new level of violation. Kaelen moved. He came around the chair and knelt before her again. But this time, he took both of her hands in his. His were warm, strong, and trembling with suppressed fury. "Look at me," he commanded gently. She forced her eyes to his. The silver was blazing, but not with cold calculation. With a ferocious protective fire. "That," he said, each word deliberate, "is a lie. It is a weapon they are using because they have nothing else. They do not know you. They do not know us." He squeezed her hands. "The bond is alive. It is growing. Do you feel it?" She did. Beneath the horror and the pain, the bond was a steady, resilient pulse. Stronger now than it had been even an hour ago. Tempered in the crucible of shared danger. "What grows can bear fruit," he said, and the meaning was unmistakable. He wasn't just talking about heirs. He was talking about them. About what could be between them, if they dared to let it. He brought her bandaged hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, right over the linen wrapping. It was a pledge, a promise, a claiming that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the man who had just knelt to tend her wounds, and was now kneeling to offer her his bruised and fearful heart. "The trap has no exit," he repeated her earlier words, his eyes holding hers. "So we stop trying to escape. We fortify it. Together." It was a surrender. A strategy of a different kind. Not to defeat the bond, but to embrace it. To make their connection their strongest wall, not their most brittle point of failure. Outside, the palace was wounded and watchful. Enemies circled, both foreign and domestic. The road ahead was paved with danger and difficult choices. But in that firelit room, with his lips on her hand, and their bond shining like a forged blade between them, Elara felt the first fragile seedling of hope take root. They were no longer the king who wouldn't to touch his queen, and the queen who waited in silence. They were two people, wounded and wary, standing back to back in a siege, finally ready to face what came next, not as a liability and a strategist, but as mates. The night was far from over, but for the first time in 15 years, she was not alone in the dark. The days that followed the attack were a study in controlled tension. The palace became a locked fortress, its usual rhythms replaced by the grim cadence of investigation. The scent of fear and suspicion was a sour undertone beneath the smells of polish and stone. Turin's interrogations were thorough and yielded a name. A junior archivist, a man with gambling debts traced back to a merchant with known Ironwood sympathies. The traitor was executed at dawn with swift, silent efficiency, a message to any others who might be tempted. The hidden passages were sealed with mortar and magic. The guard rotations were scrambled. But the true shift was not in the stone or the schedules. It was in the air between the king and queen. Kaelen's surrender in the antechamber was not a retreat into softness. It was a strategic pivot of staggering magnitude. If the bond was their exposed flank, he would no longer try to hide it. He would arm it. The bonding exercises in the map room were abruptly cancelled. Lady Celine and Master Alice were dismissed with polite thanks and the clear understanding that their services were no longer required. In their place came a new, unspoken ritual. Kaelen began taking his evening meal in Elara's solar. It was not a grand affair. A small table set before the fire. Simple food. No courtiers, no guards inside the room, though a full contingent stood outside. It was excruciatingly ordinary, and therefore revolutionary. The first night, the silence was a heavy, living thing. They had shared countless state dinners, sitting at opposite ends of a table that could seat 50, making polite, empty conversation for the benefit of others. This was different. The space was intimate. The clink of cutlery was deafening. The bond hummed with a nervous, watchful energy. Elara, her arm still tender beneath its bandage, struggled to find a topic that wasn't treason, security, or their own catastrophic history. "The early frost is threatening the Vale vineyards," she said finally, her voice too loud in the quiet. "My steward writes that they are using frost magic on the southern slopes, but it's a delicate balance. Too much magic can sour the grapes." Kaelen looked up from his plate. He seemed to be truly listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak of border patrols. The Southern Rovan pack uses a similar technique for their winter berries. They sing to the plants. An earth magic, passed down through the females. He took a sip of wine. "We could send an envoy to share techniques. It would be a good gesture after the recent tensions." It was a small thing. A practical, peaceful suggestion that acknowledged her heritage and her concerns. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a recognition of partnership. "I would like that," she said, and meant it. The conversation remained stilted, but it was a start. They spoke of the palace falconry, of a new translation of an old text from the star-touched isles, of the stubbornness of a particular ancient rose in the private garden. Safe, neutral ground. But the very act of sharing the ground, of occupying the same small, firelit space without walls or drafts between them, was an exercise in a new kind of intimacy. The bond responded. The frantic, hungry spikes of energy began to smooth into a steadier, warmer flow. It was like a wild river finding its banks. They were learning each other's presence not as a shock, but as a constant. She could feel his attention on her when she spoke, a focused, quiet respect. He could feel her cautious openness, the gradual lowering of her own shields. He never touched her, not at the table, but his eyes did. They lingered on the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, on the curve of her neck as she looked into the fire. The wanting was still there, a deep, resonant bass note in the bomb's new song, but it was no longer a source of panic. It was becoming a fact of their shared atmosphere, like the heat from the flames. One evening, after a week of these quiet meals, a violent spring storm lashed the palace. Thunder shook the ancient stones, and rain hammered the leaded windows like an army of drummers. The fire in the solar spat and hissed in sympathy. A particularly close crack of lighting made Elara jump, her hand flinching toward her chest. It was an old, childish fear, one she thought she'd buried deep. Across the table, Kaelen went still. She felt a pulse of concern through the bond, swift and clean. Then, without a word, he rose. He didn't come to her. He went to the window, standing with his back to her, looking out at the fury of the storm. "It reminds me of the Battle of the Quarrying Gorge," he said, his voice calm against the rage of the elements. The sky tore open like that, rain so hard it felt like stones. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. All you had was scent and sound and the feel of the pack link. He paused. It was terrifying and exhilarating. The purest fight I've ever known. No politics. No treaties, just survival. He was sharing a memory, a piece of his past, unvarnished and real. It was an offering. Elara watched his broad back, silhouetted against the flashes of lightning. "What did you survive for?" she asked softly. He was silent for a long moment. The thunder rolled. "For the dawn," he said simply. "To see the sun again. To know I was still alive." He turned then, his eyes finding hers in the flickering light. "It's a simpler reason than kingdom or crown." The unspoken comparison hung between them. He had fought for survival then. What was he fighting for now? The storm outside seemed to pause, holding its breath. The bond between them stretched taut, humming with a new, profound understanding. They were both survivors in their own ways. They had endured a long, cold war of silence. Now, they were navigating the storm of what came after. "I used to be afraid of thunder," Elara admitted. the confession feeling momentous in the quiet. When I was a child in the Vale, my mother would wrap me in a cloak made of woven cloud stuff and sing the songs of the still sky until I fell asleep. A ghost of a smile touched Kaelen's lips. Cloud stuff? It's very light. And it smells like rain before it falls. She found herself smiling back, a real, unguarded smile that felt strange on her face. I outgrew the fear. Mostly. Another crash of thunder, closer this time. She didn't jump, but she tensed. Kaelen pushed away from the window. He didn't approach her. He went to the hearth and picked up a heavy iron poker. He stirred the fire, sending up a shower of golden sparks. The storm is just another kind of power, he said, his back to her. Unruly, unpredictable, but it cleanses. It makes way for new growth. He replaced the poker and turned, leaning against the mantel. We can be afraid of its violence, or we can respect its strength. We can hide from it, or we can learn to stand in the rain. He was no longer talking about the weather. Elara rose from her chair. She crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet from him, near the warmth of the fire. The bond was a steady, warm pulse, aligning with the rhythm of the rain on the glass. I'm tired of hiding, she said. His eyes darkened. The wanting, always present surge, but it was tempered now with a fierce, tender pride. So am I. They stood there, not touching, as the storm raged outside. The inches between them were charged with 15 years of longing, fear, and now, a fragile, hard-won trust. The distance was no longer a chasm. It was a space alive with possibility. The next morning, the world was washed clean and sparkling. The crisis for the moment had passed. The traitor was gone. The security breaches sealed. A fragile calm had settled. It was then that the invitation arrived. A formal scroll, borne by a dust-covered messenger from the Southern Rovan Pack. An invitation to the Great Howl, a biannual gathering of all the allied packs. It was a celebration of alliance, a show of strength, and a vital political forum. Traditionally, the Alpha King and his mate attended. Kaelen brought the scroll to her solar in the clear light of day. He laid it on the table between them. It's in a moon's time. At the stone circle in Rovan territory, Elara understood the implications immediately. It would be their first public appearance since the challenge, since the bond had awakened. Every alpha, every ally, every rival would be watching. They would be scrutinizing every gesture, every word, the space between them. The story of the faint thread, the attack, the rumors of a barren queen, would all be in the air. It would be a trial by public perception. We have to go, she said, her voice steady. He nodded. Yes, not going would be seen as weakness, as confirmation of the rumors. He tapped the scroll. But going as we were, a king and a queen who share a treaty, but not a life, that is also a weakness. He looked at her, and the question in his eyes was clear. The meals by the fire were a beginning, a private understanding. The Great Howl required a performance of unity on a grand public stage. They had a moon to learn the steps. Then we go as we are, Elara said, lifting her chin. Not as we were. We go with the bond, not as a secret or a problem, but as a fact. A slow, real smile spread across Kaelen's face. It transformed him, carving lines of warmth and life into the usually stern planes. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. A fact, he agreed. He reached across the table, not for her hand, but to point at a line on the invitation. There will be a mate's run, the night before the howl. A tradition. The mated pairs run together under the full moon. It's symbolic. A run. Together. As mates. In front of everyone. Her heart leapt into her throat. It was one thing to stand beside him. It was another to run with him in a ritual steeped in primal connection. I have never shifted in front of your people. Her veil heritage granted her a different kind of magic, a connection to moon and growth, not the wolf shift of his kin. Her otherness had always been a subtle barrier. You don't have to shift, he said, his voice gentle. You are moon-crowned. You run with the moon's blessing, in whatever form you choose. That is our fact too. Our fact. The words were a balm. The decision was made. The next moon became a silent deadline, not of fear, but of purpose. Their quiet dinners took on a new layer. They began to discuss the politics of the various pacts, the alliances, the grudges. She shared her insights from years of observing the court, her understanding of the subtle languages of flora and gesture from her own culture. He shared the blunt, pact-based hierarchies, the history of feuds and oaths. They were building a shared intelligence, weaving their knowledge together. The bond thrived on it. It became a conduit not just for emotion, but for information, for a growing sense of shared purpose. The wanting was still there, a sweet, persistent ache, but it was now part of a larger tapestry that included respect, partnership, and a dawning, terrified hope. One afternoon, a week before their departure, Kaelen found her in the private garden, studying a late-blooming winter rose, its petals edged in frost. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar warmth at her side. The Rovan Alpha, he said without preamble, has 3 sons. The youngest is unmated. He is ambitious. He may see an opportunity in the rumors, a test, a warning. He was trusting her with the unvarnished truth of what they might face. Elara kept her eyes on the rose. And what is your advice, my king? How should the queen respond to such ambition? She felt his gaze on her profile. The queen, he said, his voice dropping, should remember that she is mine, and that her king has very poor tolerance for anyone who forgets it. The possessiveness in his voice was no longer a scary, abstract thing. It was a promise of protection, a declaration of intent. It sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She turned to face him. And if the queen, she said, meeting his glowing eyes, wants to remind them herself. A spark of fierce approval lit his face. He reached out then, finally bridging the last of the cautious distance they'd maintained. He didn't take her hand. He touched a single fingertip to the mithril circlet on her brow, tracing its cool, star-pierced edge. Then she should wear her crown, he murmured, his touch featherlight, and let it shine. His fingertip trailed down, barely skimming her temple, before he pulled his hand back, as if the contact was almost too much. But the point was made. The line had been crossed. The touch was no longer an accident or a necessity. It was a choice. The bond surged, a wave of golden warmth that had nothing to do with the weak winter sun. It was the warmth of a forge, of something being tempered and made strong. They stood in the frost-laced garden, the unspoken future stretching before them, as tangible as the invitation to the great howl. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was a language they were just beginning to learn, and its first, clear word was together. The stone circle of Rovan was not built of stone, but of towering ancient oaks, whose interlocking branches formed a vast living cathedral. Moonlight, fat and full, poured through the leafy ceiling, dappling the gathered wolves below in silver and shadow. The air thrummed with a low, collective energy, the buzz of politics, the snap of rivalry, and the deep, resonant pulse of primal power. Elara stood at the edge of the clearing, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes. She was a splash of cool color in a sea of leather, fur, and battle scars. Her gown was the deep blue of a midnight sky, embroidered with shimmering threads that caught the moonlight like captured stars. The mithril circlet felt like a helm. At her side, Kaelen was a pillar of contained force in his ceremonial black, the obsidian wolf heads on his pauldrons seeming to smile at the night. The bond between them was a live wire, humming with a shared, focused tension. This was the trial. They had arrived that afternoon to a reception of layered courtesy. The greetings from the allied alphas were correct, but their eyes were sharp, assessing the space between king and queen, the quality of their silence. The rumors had flown ahead of them, carried by wind and whisper, the faint thread, the attack, the barren queen. Elara had felt the scrutiny like a physical pressure, but she had kept her head high, her greetings gracious, her hand resting lightly on Kaelen's offered arm. A simple, deliberate touch that sent a visible ripple through the watching crowd. Now, on the eve of the great howl, came the mate's run. The Rovan Alpha, a massive, russet-furred man named Barren, raised his arms. The moon kisses the stones. Let the bound run, and let their bonds strengthen the pack ties of all. A cheer rose, raw and hungry. All around them, mated pairs began to shed their human forms. The air crackled with the sound of shifting bones and stretching sinew. In moments, the clearing's edge was alive with wolves of every size, and color-sleek grey hunters, massive tawny brutes, small, swift shadows nuzzling, nipping, tails held high in unity. Kaelen turned to her. In the noise, his voice was for her alone, carried on the private channel of the bond as much as in her ear. You do not have to do this. You can wait here. No one would think less of you. She looked at the gathering wolves, at the challenging, curious glances shot their way. To stay was to admit difference, to confirm a separation. She met his gaze. Through the bond, she let him feel her resolve. A cool, steady flame. I run with my king. A flicker of pride, fierce and warm, crossed his face. He gave a single sharp nod. Then he stepped back, and the transformation took him. It was not the first time she had seen him shift, but it was the first time she was the focus of it. There was no violent wrenching, no scream of agony as in the stories of lesser wolves. It was a fluid, powerful melting. His form blurred at the edges, silver light shimmering around him like heat haze. His body re-knit itself with a series of low, dense clicks. Where a man had stood, now stood a wolf of legend. He was enormous, larger than any other in the clearing. His fur was the color of winter smoke and shadow, with a silvery mane that ruffled in the night breeze. His eyes were the same molten silver, holding a vast, ancient intelligence. He was terrifying. He was magnificent. He padded toward her, his movements liquid grace, and lowered his great head, nudging her hand with his cold, damp nose. The bond in this form was different, a simpler, purer stream of instinct and emotion. Protectiveness, pride, a question. Elara took a deep breath. She would not shift. She could not. But she was not powerless. She was of the silver veil, where magic was in the blood and the moonlight was a birthright. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, centering herself. She called not on the wildness of the wolf, but on the deep, quiet magic of her lineage. She thought of moonlit glades, of roots drinking deep from secret springs, of growth that persevered through frost. When she opened her eyes, a soft, phosphorescent glow limned her body. It was subtle, a sheen like dew on a spiderweb under the moon. Tiny, illusory blossoms of frost fire seemed to bloom and fade in her wake as she took a step. She was not a wolf. She was a queen of another kind of wild. A murmur ran through the crowd, part surprise, part awe. This was not what they expected. Kaelen's wolf watched her, his head tilted. Through the bond, she felt a surge of wonder that was entirely his own. Then he turned and loped toward the starting line at the edge of the trees. A clear invitation. The run began. It was not a race, but a flowing, chaotic stream of bonded pairs moving into the deep forest. Elara ran. She had not run like this since she was a girl in the Vale, but her body remembered the rhythm, the sure-footed grace. Her gown flowed around her, a magical glow marking her path. And beside her, a shadow and a shield, ran Kaelen. He matched his pace to hers, a silent, powerful escort. They wove through the moon-dappled trees, the sounds of the other runners a rustling, panting orchestra around them. The bond was their compass. She felt his awareness of the terrain, his instinctual mapping of safe paths, his constant, subconscious check on her stamina. She, in turn, let her magic flow into the bond, a calming, steadying influence, a touch of clarity in the primal frenzy. They passed other pairs. Some ran in synchronized harmony, a single mind in two bodies. Others were more playful, nipping and darting. They passed the youngest son of the Rovan Alpha, a handsome, swaggering wolf with eyes that lingered on Elara with open appraisal. As he moved to cut closer, Kaelen let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in the earth. It was not a king's command. It was a wolf's warning, pure and unequivocal. Mine. The younger wolf dropped back, chastened. They ran deeper into the silent heart of the forest, away from the others. The world narrowed to the rhythm of her breath, the beat of her heart, the solid, reassuring presence of the great wolf at her side. The political calculations, the fearful rumors, the weight of 15 years, all of it fell away, burned off by the simple, arduous joy of movement, of shared purpose. They broke into a small, hidden glade where a waterfall cascaded into a moon-silvered pool. Here, they stopped. Elara leaned against a smooth rock, catching her breath, the magical glow around her fading to a gentle pulse. Kaelen shifted back. One moment the giant wolf stood drinking from the pool. The next, the man was kneeling there, cupping water in his hands, his back to her. The shift back was as seamless as the first. He rose, water dripping from his chin, his chest bare and gleaming in the moonlight. He turned to face her. They were alone, truly alone, for the first time since the tower. But nothing was the same. The air between them was not charged with desperate confession or the shock of violence. It was thick with the aftermath of the run, with a partnership proven under the eyes of their world. The bond was a quiet, profound hum, a settled, undeniable truth. He walked toward her, his steps slow. He stopped an arm's length away. His eyes travelled over her face, flushed from the run, over the faint, fading magic that still clung to her skin like starlight. "You were glorious," he said, his voice rough. "So were you." He lifted a hand, and this time there was no hesitation. He traced the line of her jaw with his knuckles, a touch so reverent it made her eyes sting. "When he looked at you, the Rovan pup, I wanted to tear his throat out." The admission was stark, possessive, true. "I know," she whispered. "I felt it. Does it frighten you?" His thumb brushed her lower lip. "The violence of what I feel for you." She looked up into his silver eyes, seeing the man, the king, the wolf, all one and the same. "No," she said, and it was the truest word she had ever spoken. "It doesn't frighten me. The silence frightened me. The vial frightened me. This," she leaned into his touch, "this feels like finally being alive." A shudder ran through him. The last of his control, the final wall he had built around his heart, crumbled to dust. The bond opened wide, a floodgate releasing, and she was awash in it, all the depth of his loneliness, the magnitude of his fear, the sheer, staggering scale of his love. It had been there, buried under duty and dread for 15 long years. A love he had never dared name, even to himself. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Kaelen. He didn't let her finish. He closed the distance between them, and his mouth found hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a claiming, a confession, a release. It was the answer to every unspoken question, the end of every lonely night. It was fire and moonlight, hunger and homecoming. His arms came around her, crushing her to him, and she clung to him, her fingers digging into the hard muscles of his back. The bond sang a triumphant, ecstatic song, weaving them together at the deepest level. It was no longer a thread or a bridge. It was a fusion, a completion. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing raggedly. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. "I have waited a lifetime to do that," he breathed. "So have I." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. "I love you, Elara. I have loved you since I saw you at the treaty signing. A vision in silver who looked at me not with fear of the wolf, but with the calm of the moon. I have loved you through every silent year. I am sorry. I am so sorry it took me so long to be brave enough to say it." Her heart felt too large for her chest. "I love you," she said, the words unlocking a chamber in her soul she'd kept sealed forever. "I never stopped hoping." He kissed her again, softer this time, a seal on the vow. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a decade and a half, he swept her into his arms. He carried her away from the pool, to a soft bed of moss beneath the oldest oak. There, under the witness of the full moon and the ancient trees, with the bond blazing like a newborn sun between them, the king finally touched his queen. There was no more sleeping draught, no more distance, no more fear. There was only the slow, worshipful discovery of each other, a conversation of skin and sigh and shivering wonder. It was an apology and a promise. It was a claiming and a surrender. It was the healing of a wound 15 years deep, and the glorious, terrifying beginning of everything. Later, as dawn tinged the sky with pale rose and gold, they walked hand in hand back toward the stone circle. They moved slowly, wrapped in a quiet that was full, not empty. Their bond was visible now, not as a desperate thread, but as a soft, golden aura that enveloped them both, a visible testament to a union fully realized. The gathered packs, stirring for the morning ceremonies, saw them emerge from the trees. They saw the changed space between them, the effortless closeness, the serene, unshakable unity in their eyes. They saw the way Kaelen's thumb stroked the back of Elara's hand, the way she leaned into his shoulder. They saw the bonds glow, strong and steady. The whispers died before they began. The speculative looks turned to nods of respect. The challenge in the eyes of rivals like the roven youngest son dimmed to resigned acknowledgement. The story was written in their linked hands, in their peaceful faces, in the air around them that hummed with a power that was both gentle and absolute. They had come to the great howl as a king and a queen bound by a fragile treaty. They would leave as Alpha and Luna, their bond no longer a secret weakness, but the cornerstone of their strength. The fruitless tree had not been cut down. It had been waiting for the right season to bloom. As they took their place at the center of the stone circle for the final rites, Kaelen leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Welcome home, my love." Elara looked up at him, at her king, her mate, her love, and smiled a smile that held all the joy and peace of a dawn after a long, long night. She squeezed his hand, their bond a warm, eternal sun in her chest. "I am home. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.